Okay, we're back again. We are on chapter 14, George and Marina, the Duke and Duchess of Kent. And in this chapter, this is the aftermath of George's death. So it's here where we see Marina learn how to deal with her grief. She's raising 3 young children, and how her sisters helped her and not wallowing in her grief. So I'm going to get started. The chapter is entitled let's see if I can get this right. Min, Eddie, Pudding, and Maow. And those are the nicknames of the children. So I will go ahead and get started. In its initial stages, the intensity of Marina's grief at Prince George's death was so acute that it caused much concern within the royal family. The king and queen did what they could, as did Queen Mary, even though it was she who lost no time in warning Marina not to surrender to self-pity or to allow grief to overwhelm her. She had, said the Queen Dowager, who knew all about putting duty first, a responsibility and a duty to every other war widow. Nobody but Queen Mary, who had of course lost a much-loved son and was coping with her own grief, could have been as forthright, and Marina understood what she said. Yeah, now remember, Queen Mary was very, very close to Prince George. They bonded because they had such similar interests in art and history, and they had a lot of similarities that they liked together. So she felt a very strong affinity to Prince George. Nevertheless, in those first days and weeks, all attempts to reach the Duchess in her misery were not helped by the palpable sense of distance that always existed between her and her husband's family, and for which Marina herself was entirely responsible. In the same way that Princess Nicholas was only too conscious of her heritage and position and didn't let others forget it, so Marina was acutely aware of who she was, not just as Duchess of Kent, but more significantly, a thoroughbred princess of both royal and imperial descent. As such, she exuded a distinct air of superiority. The result was that she was never properly absorbed into the British royal family, who, as Kenneth Rose, the distinguished historian and Kent family friend, put it, did not share her consciousness of royalty as a caste apart, or of a Europe composed more of dynasties than of nations. None of this is intended to imply that the Duchess was not warmly regarded by members of the royal family. It was simply that through the divisive influences of background, intellect, and cultivation, Marina never felt particularly close to her in-laws. Indeed, she resented the fact that both her sisters-in-law, Queen Elizabeth and Alice, the Duchess of Gloucester, neither of whom were of royal birth. She would refer to them as those common little Scottish girls, and they held senior ranking positions to her own. As time went by, it also became clear that there was no love lost between Marina and Queen Elizabeth. As Cecil Beaton would put it, in many years later, the Queen Mother adored Princess Marina the moment she died. When she was alive, she hated her. Now, without George at her side, the divisions would become even more pronounced. Impotent to penetrate the shadows surrounding the grieving Duchess, George VI recognized that she needed to be comforted by a member of her own family. To that end, he persuaded Churchill despite anticipated opposition from within Parliament and the press, to permit Princess Paul to come to England. Churchill gave his approval. The king sent a telegram to Kenya, and on the 10th of September, accompanied by Madame Lila Raleigh, an old friend of Marina, and herself, Princess Olga set out on a journey that took her through Uganda, the Cameroons, Nigeria, and the West African coast of Portugal. From where she traveled in Ireland, thence across the Irish seas to Poole Harbor in Dorset on England's south coast. Her circuitous route ended when she finally arrived at Coppens 1 week later. It was the first time that Olga and Marina had seen one another for more than 2 years, and had given these extraordinary circumstances, it was an intensely emotional reunion. It wasn't long, however, before the expected backlash to Princess Paul's presence began. Under protection of parliamentary privilege, Captain Alec Cunningham Reid, a Tory MP for St. Marylebone, stood up in the House of Commons and fired the first salvo in the slanderous campaign against the princess that would last for several weeks. Referring to Olga as a sinister woman and strongly implying that she was a spy, Cunningham Reid finally demanded on 16 December, "Has not this lady been allowed to be in a position whereby she will be able to convey information to her quizzling husband, which might be invaluable to the Axis?" At that, Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden leapt to his feet and sharply rounded on Captain Cunningham Reid. "The circumstances are well known," he countered. "Princess Olga was the only sister of the Duchess of Kent who could come to this country at all, and she came here with the government's authority and approval. I have no apology to make in the matter." When Eden had finished speaking, the entire house rang with cheers. With her sister's support, Princess Marina's life began to slowly return to some kind of recognizable form. Members of the royal family continued to drive over to Coppens, and old friends such as Chips Channon, Nancy Astor, and Bobbity Cranborne, later the 5th Marquis of Salisbury, then leader of the House of Lords, began paying afternoon visits. Lila Raleigh also proved diverting company, entertaining the royal sisters with amusing stories and shared reminiscence. By the end of September, Marina felt up to writing replies to some of the messages of sympathy she had received. On the 29th, she picked up one of Cecil Banton's photographs of George, Michael, and herself to send to President Roosevelt. In her distinguished angular calligraphy, on black-edged writing paper embossed with her husband's Art Deco decipher, the Duchess wrote, "I want to send to you this photograph of your godson that was taken when he was 6 weeks old. It is the last one of my husband, and I hope I will have the pleasure of introducing him to you in the not-too-distant future." 6 weeks later, on 7 November, Queen Wilhelmina of Netherlands sent Roosevelt her own impressions of Prince Michael. She wrote, "I had to wait some time after the tragic death of George the Kent to go and see our godchild. Now have just visited Marina and seen little Michael. He's such a darling. He was in a very good temper and has such a radiant laugh and a fine big blue eyes and much golden hair that even stands up in a crest. I think he will later on very much resemble his father. In the event of little Michael like his sister Alexandra, grew to resemble Marina. Only Eddie, in almost every single respect, took after his father. Within 10 weeks of her husband's death, Marina put on her commandant's uniform to fulfill the first public engagement of her widowhood. On 4 November 1942, solemn but composed, she visited Wren training centers in London. Writing to her mother in law, Queen Elizabeth, said, I have seen Marina several times. She seems much better and still very brave and trying to take up the threads of her life again. Poor darling, one's heartache for her in that little house, with such very lively children. At the invitation of the king and queen, Burke Hall, an 18th century house on Royal Deeside, which is today the home of the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall, was put at Marina's disposal for summer holidays, a place where those lively children could let off steam. Writing to Queen Mary from Balmoral on August 1944, the Queen said, Marina seems very happy at Burke Hall and is all out all day with the children. We have met for picnics, and she brought Eddie to lunch after church. He is a dear little boy and much improved in manners. The children are well, and it is so nice to see very bright eyes and pink cheeks again. By the summer of 1944, Marina had become involved with some of the organizations which Prince George had been actively associated. She said, for example, become patron of the Royal School of the Blind as well as the training ship Arethusa, a four-mast naval frigate moored up at Upon-Nor on the River Medway in Kent. Later still, in succession to the Duke, she was appointed Colonel-in-Chief of the Royal West Kent Regiment, subsequently the Queen's Regiment, from which, on the day of Prince George's funeral, a battalion had been detailed to line the West Aisles at St. George's Chapel as part of the ceremonial guard of honor. And it was at St. George's Chapel, the magnificent church found by Edward III 5 centuries earlier, that the Duchess of Kent made a particularly poignant visit on the 20th of December 1942. The day that ought to have been her husband's 40th birthday. Driving to Windsor, Marina climbed down the narrow, winding staircase just beyond the tombs of Edward VII and Queen Alexandra to the royal vault, and there laid a wreath of clove carnations on her husband's coffin. 11 days later, on New Year's Eve, Princess Olga left England to return to Kenya, where Prince Paul now lay in a desperate state of illness. Profoundly depressed by the fate of Yugoslavia, which Germany had ultimately invaded, the death of his brother-in-law and great friend Prince George, his wife's absence, and Alec Cunningham Reed's bitter invective of which he was well aware, the former Prince Regent took to his bed, rarely bothering to get up, refusing all offers of food, and drinking nothing more than a daily cup of hot chocolate. Hopes that Princess Olga's return might halt her husband's psychological decline were short-lived, so much so that on February 1943, Prince Paul's doctors feared the development of insanity in the form of melancholia. It's very sad. Churchill continued to resist all petitions for the family to be allowed to move to South Africa, but in the end he was brought around. On the 11th of June, which was also Olga's 40th birthday, the Prince and Princess Paul, with their sons Alexander and Nicholas and their daughters Elizabeth, left Kenya for Johannesburg, where, free from the suspicions and no longer regarded as a prisoner, Paul's health began to improve. For Marina, concern over her brother in law and the strain of his condition imposed on her sister proved cathartic, helping to channel her thoughts into another direction. Work also continued to play a part in her recovery, and during 1943, the Duchess made a full return to public life. In addition to the official duties which occupied her, Marina was to pay tribute to her late husband's pre-war work, when she too became a factory inspector. Another tribute she paid to Prince George followed the royal tradition of leaving rooms and possessions undisturbed. In November 1942, the Channons spent a weekend at Coppens, after which Chip noted, "The Duchess has rearranged her sitting room, kept the Duke's just as it was, and has shut up the music room. Went up to bed about midnight, and I was haunted by the spirit of the Duke. Every room and object is so inspired by him. The house, in fact, is him. I met him on the staircase, saw him sitting at the end of my bed, and as he so often used to do, and was constantly aware of him. The house still vibrates with his vivacious personality." Coppens was now officially owned by Eddie. It had been left to him in trust until he came of age. Until he grew up and married, it of course remained very much Marina's home. Indeed, with the exception of a couple rooms which her mother-in-law had put in her disposal at Marlborough House, Queen Mary's official London residence, Marina had no other home. When the Kents first moved to Ivor, George, like Princess Victoria before him, had soon become a familiar figure in the village, and in time, Marina followed suit. Even today, some of the local people remember how, when walking to St. Peter's Church on a Sunday morning or pottering about the village, the Duchess always had a smile and a good morning for everyone. John Evans, who lived in Ivor until 1956 and who was a teenager, was the delivery boy for the local grocers, provided a brief glimpse into Marina's more domestic existence when he said, "I used to deliver groceries twice a week to the rear entrance at Coppens. I had an errand bike with a huge basket on the front. Prince Edward had a ride on it when he was quite young. The Duchess, wearing an apron and a headscarf, was often in the kitchen cooking. A few times on very hot days, she gave me a homemade ice cream, a real treat for a wartime lad. She would always call me John and asked about my family. I suppose even as a boy I was flattered. But that's the kind of person she was. I believe the whole village loved and respected her. She was a grand lady." That's so interesting. Marina had such a personal touch, and George did, and I think that's so remarkable for local villagers. Home and family were always foremost features in Princess Marina's life. Her love for Eddie, Michael, and Maow, the rhyme with now, as he was known, and Alexandra, or Pudding, as the family called her during her adolescence, was total. Nevertheless, as a parent, Min, the name by which Marina was known to by her children and other members of the royal family, tempered indulgence with an insistence on strict discipline, good behavior, and impeccable manners. Even as an adult, Eddie, Pudding, and Maow ran the risk of incurring their mother's extreme displeasure by the slightest breach of this rigid code of conduct. Another lesson the Duchess of Kent instilled in her children was the value of money. Nothing, she warned, would ever be theirs just for the asking. One example of this was provided by Clifford Wade, who was for many years the local chemist in Ivor. Eddie and Alexandra were regular visitors to his shop, and he recalled an ocean excuse me. I'll just reread that sentence again. Eddie and Alexandra were regular visitors to his shop, and he recalled an occasion when they came in together to spend the first of their pocket money they had ever received. Between them, they had exactly 6 pence, otherwise half a shilling, 2.5 pence in today's currency, and it was clear that neither really knew how wisely to spend it or on what. After some while, Clifford Wade heard a great deal of whispering and looked up. They saw the younger Duke and his sister arguing over a bar of highly perfumed soap. Eddie was heard to say that they would never be able to use any soap other than that already in their bathroom, while Alexandra insisted they could easily smuggle it into the house without anyone finding out. She suggested she could use it first and then surreptitiously pass it on to Eddie when it was his bath time. Whether the ruse worked only they are the ones who can say. But all events, in what bordered on triumph, the children handed over their pocket money and gleefully marched off out of the shop. Chip's cannon, Princess Alexandra, gauche, gangly, and full of energy, was a whirlwind of a girl. Eddie was most diffident, hypersensitive, and on occasion possessed much of the same bad temper as his father. Michael, on the other hand, while sharing his sister's more even temperament, was as reticent as his brother, perhaps even more so. Even as an adult in his early 20s living at Kensington Palace in London, he might ask one of his mother's footmen to accompany him to a nearby St. Mary's Abbot's Church, just in case somebody should recognize him and stop to pass the time. Towards the end of the war, one of Princess Marina's first considerations was fulfilling plans for her children's education. In 1943, Eddie had been sent to Ludgrove, a preparatory school near Wokingham in Berkshire. 5 years later, as planned at the time of his birth, he went on to Eton, but by 1951 he had been removed from England's foremost public school, apparently for health reasons, and completed his education at La Roseraie, an internationally renowned boarding school on the shores of Lake Geneva in rural Switzerland. Later on, he entered the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst and was subsequently commissioned into the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards. Like Eddie, Prince Michael went first to preparatory school, this time at Sunningdale, followed by Eton and then Sandhurst. After training with the Royal Armour Corps of Bovington Camp in Dorset, Maow was commissioned into the 11th Hussars, afterwards the Royal Hussars, which are the Prince Wales' own. Academic life for Alexandra was far less rigorous. At the age of 11, she became the first British princess to attend boarding school. Oh, that's an interesting fact. I didn't know that. Well, I guess because Elizabeth and Margaret were schooled at home. They were homeschooled. So, anyways, onwards. That chosen by her mother was Heathfield in North Ascot, run by Miss Kathleen Dodds, a young and progressive head teacher who tended to concentrate on the overall development of her students as individuals rather than count the number of potential candidates for university. After Heathfield, the princess went on to Paris, where, during the winter of 1953 and 1954, she stayed with Comte de Paris and his family before going on to finishing school. When she returned to London, Alexandra took a short nursing course at the Great Ormond Street Hospital for sick children. However, Wherever the children were educated, the Duchess of Kent had to meet the cost herself, and financially, the 10 years from 1943 to 1953 were difficult for her. During her brief married life, neither she nor Prince George had any financial worries at all. Indeed, with a considerable private fortune of his own, he had, for example, inherited £750,000 from his father. £750,000 back then was quite a large sum of money. It would carry you through quite a lot, as well as £25,000 annually from the civil list. With the anticipated increases in years ahead, life couldn't have been more rosier. In fact, in 1940, Prince George had even discussed selling Coppens and buying a much larger property in the home counties. When drawing up his will as a young man in his 30s, with a not unnatural expectation of full life before him, therefore, the Duke of Kent left his personal wealth in trust for his children. When he died, however, his civil list income died with him, which meant that while she was scarcely destitute, the Duchess had not been provided for. Contrary to George's belief, the civil list at the time did not make provisions for royal widows. Okay, at this moment, I'm going to pause. We'll see. Um, that didn't hinder Marina at all. Um, we see she becomes quite resourceful and never lets the kids' style or her status as a royal princess suffer. And you see her become quite resourceful. And she did not get any kind of income until Queen Elizabeth II um, became the queen, and there were amendments to the civil list. The result was that no matter how humiliating, as she put it, Marina's only recourse was to sell off some of George's possessions in order to boost her capital and maintain a standard of living which, if not the equal of what she had become used to over the last 8 years, would still be recognizable. The first sale was in November 1943. It consisted of furniture left to Prince George by his great aunt, Princess Louise, the Duchess of Argyll, which, because he didn't want it, George had already decided to sell. At auction, it realized almost £20,000. 4 years later, on March 1947, a further £92,341 was raised when the Duchess sent silver, furniture, pictures, and porcelain to be auctioned off at Christie's. Among the pictures she had sold at the time were the celebrated Altair Claudette, which sold for £5,300 and were brought by the American-born Huddleston Broughton, the first Baron of Fairhaven, to grace the walls of his country house, Ainsley Abbey, near Cambridge. To help out, both George VI and Queen Mary also provided the Duchess with private, undisclosed allowances. Later, following the sudden death of the king in February 1952, the accession to the throne of his elder daughter as Queen Elizabeth II, the civil list came under parliamentary review and was increased by £25,000. From this additional sum, although it did not amount to the full annuity, Marina had been hoping to receive as a working member of the royal family. The new queen officially allocated her aunt an allowance of £5,000 a year. In 2013, that sum equated to somewhere in the region of £400,000. And in the early 1950s, according to property advertisements at the time, £5,000 was still enough to buy a fine country house with a considerable acreage. Yeah, okay. That's quite a bit of money. £400,000 a year, that's quite a bit of money, at least to me. It is undeniably true that as a widow, Marina, the Duchess of Kent, who left a relatively modest $54,121 net pounds net when she died, was never as excessively wealthy as many of her Windsor in-laws. But persistent claims that this princess, who knew all about thrift from her days as a Parisian exile, was hard up or poverty-stricken, were very wide on the mark, especially when seen in relation to most people's lives. Not for them, a four-story Wren-built grace and favor house of upwards of 20 rooms and an apartment one at Kensington Palace, or the services of a private secretary, ladies-in-waiting, and office staff, to say nothing of a domestic household of a dozen paid servants, butlers, an under-butler, housekeeper, 3 footmen, 2 housemaids, a chef, a switchboard operator, manning 6 lines and 30 extensions, and 2 chauffeurs to drive the Duchess's dark blue 1951 Phantom 4 Rolls-Royce, which was later exchanged for a larger, more modern model. As an employer, Marina was very well regarded by her staff. Even though she couldn't seem rather imperious, as one footman recalled her, she never looked directly at you when she spoke to you, and she would never repeat an instruction. But life below the stairs of number 1 Kensington Palace was not without amusement, as happened on one occasion when a newly employed under-butler was learning the ropes. As he was helping to prepare the breakfast things, the butler came into the kitchen and announced, "Marina wants bacon," and an opening of the fridge door added, "And we haven't got any." It was apparent not something that she often asked for. It was apparently not something she often asked for. Turning to the new under-butler, he said, "Pop next door and see if they've got any." In doing so, he saw an elderly woman at a downstairs window putting flowers in a vase. "Marina wants bacon for breakfast, and we haven't got any," he told her. "Do you have any?" And she said, "Oh, I think we may have. I'll have a look." Minutes later, she returned with a few rashers, and a royal breakfast was duly served. Soon afterwards, when Marina was entertaining a few friends to tea, the very same under-butler found himself opening the door to the very same elderly woman who had helped him out with the bacon. He looked astonishingly, greatly amused. He looked at excuse me. His look of astonishment greatly amused Princess Alice, the Countess of Athlone, who, putting her finger to her lips, whispered, "Shh, it'll be our little secret." It might also be borne in mind that throughout the 26 years of her widowhood, whether in the salons at Kensington Palace or Coppens, Princess Marina continued to entertain in a way Prince George would have recognized. She made frequent trips abroad to family and friends and enjoyed regular skiing holidays. And where her wardrobe was concerned, though thoroughly in her costings, which were always made in advance of firm orders, she was never short of couture day, and even wearing designers such as John Cavanagh, Norman Hartwell, and Victor Steibel. At her death, Marina, a excuse me again. At her death, Marina bequeathed a magnificent collection of jewelry, diamonds, sapphires, and pearls in the form of tiaras, necklaces, earrings, brooches, clips, and bracelets to her daughter and daughter-in-law, with an additional provision for the future wife of Prince Michael. Throughout the Second World War, the Duchess of Kent's first cousin, Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, the only son of her father's brother, Prince Andrew, served in the British Royal Navy. When not at sea, the tall, blond, Nordic-looking prince was frequently to be found at Coppens. And when Prince Philip was there, the king's elder daughter, Lilibet, and Princess Elizabeth was known within the family, was rarely very far away. Marina, who in 1944 had done much to further the romance between another of her cousins, Alexandra of Greece, the posthumous daughter of King Alexander and Aspasia Manos, and King Peter II of Yugoslavia, for whom her brother-in-law, Prince Paul, had acted as regent, derived much pleasure at watching another and yet a more significant courtship develop under her own roof. For some considerable time, Philip and Lilibet had waited for George VI to give his consent to their engagement, and in July 1947, he finally did. At their wedding in Westminster Abbey 4 months later, on 20 November, the 11-year-old Princess Alexandra was one of her cousin's 8 bridesmaids, while 5-year-old Prince Michael and 6-year-old Prince William of Gloucester, who at 30 would also lose his life in an air crash, were Princess Elizabeth's page boys or train bearers. At the wedding rehearsal in the Abbey, as Sir Michael Duff related to Cecil Beaton afterwards, Michael of Kent punched cousin William of Gloucester in the kisser, which alarmed our Duchess Marina considerably, and he received a good talking to from Granny, the Queen Mary, who, with a parasol in hand, was prepared for action should it occur on the day. Yeah, you don't want to mess with Marina or Queen Mary. On the day, the bride's bouquet went missing and the band of her diamond fringed tiara snapped, causing panic at the palace. But at Westminster Abbey, the 2 young princes in their kilts and sporrans, patent-buckled shoes, and lace-frilled silk shirts behaved themselves impeccably. At this, the last truly royal wedding Britain is ever really going to see, and the bride and the bridegroom were both royal highnesses by birth. A highly excitable 11-year-old Alexandra, in her Hartnell-designed star-spangled ivory tulle dress, also passed the ordeal with flying colors. On a day or two later, when she was back at school, however, she begged not to have to join a party at Heathfield Girls on an outing to the cinema to watch a film of the royal wedding. With no wish to see herself on screen, she remonstrated that, if made to go, she would die of embarrassment. I see your point. From the Duchess of Kent, the 1940s came to an end on a much happier note than they had begun. The war was over. She had accepted the loss of her husband, her home life, in spite of its inevitable changes, followed a comfortable pattern. Her mother and sisters were again free, and as always, she was surrounded by her friends who adored her. In 1948, Marina, who even during the war had was featured regularly in newspapers and magazines, thought they were drastically reduced in size and content, was as newsworthy as ever, appearing at a variety of daytime events, gala functions, dinner parties, and soirees in a way that was reminiscent of the days of when she and Prince George, as high society's most golden couple, dazzled London and with the Prince of Wales dominated the 1930s social scene. At the start of the year, the diary pages noted that the Duchess had attended a service at St. Mark's Church, North Audley Street in Mayfair, in remembrance of Mrs. Laura Corrigan, an American-born multimillionaire society hostess, at one time telephonist from Cleveland, Ohio. For the late Miss Corrigan, a rival of such famous hostesses as Lady Emerald Cunard, a fellow American, and the Honorable Mrs. Ronnie Greville, who liked to boast of the number of red carpets she got through annually receiving royalty at Polesden Lacey. It was exactly the kind of tribute she would have reveled in, especially since the Duchess of Kent had never before attended a non-royal memorial service. A little later, on 17 February, at a party given by Miss Sacheverell Sitwell for the legendary Mae West, who was then appearing in Diamond Lil at the Prince of Wales Theatre, Marina not only met the star herself, but also the comedian and movie star, Danny Kaye. On the 1st of March, their paths crossed again. That evening, Chips Cannon, inveterate collector of crowned heads, princes, and celebrities, gave an immense supper party at his house in Belgrave Square in honor of the mesmeric Mr. Kaye, who was currently starring in his own show at the London Palladium. For the Duchess and the celebrated entertainer, it was the start of a long and close friendship. Indeed, whenever he was in England, Kaye would invariably stay with Marina at Kensington Palace or Coppins. Oh my gosh, who knew? Danny Kaye and Princess Marina had a nice, long, good, deep friendship. So that's the end of this chapter, chapter 14. 2 more to go. The next one is, I believe it's on Prince Edward and his proposal to his current wife, the current Duke and Duchess of Kent. So I'll wrap that up. And it's the next chapter is chapter 15, the royal proposal. So I'll do that in a separate episode.